with tears rolling endlessly down my face. Sometimes people think the pain of being a single mother ends when another man marries you. Nobody tells them that sometimes that is where the real pain begins. My name is Kate, and this is the story that changed my life forever. 10 years earlier, life was completely different. I was once happily married to my first husband, Emeka. He was not rich, but he loved me sincerely. We lived in a small apartment in Surulere, Lagos. Every evening after work, he would buy roasted corn by the roadside before coming home. We laughed together, we struggled together, we dreamed together. Then one terrible night changed everything. Emeka died in a fatal accident along 3rd Mainland Bridge while returning from work during heavy rainfall. Just like that, my entire world collapsed overnight. One moment, I was a wife. The next moment, I became a widow with a 3-year-old son. I still remember the day they brought his body home. Women were crying everywhere. Men stood outside discussing the accident quietly. I sat beside his lifeless body, unable to cry because the pain was too heavy for tears. My son David kept asking innocent questions. "Mommy, why is Daddy sleeping like this?" That question nearly destroyed me completely. After the burial, everybody slowly disappeared. Friends stopped visiting, relatives became distant. The same people who promised support during the funeral suddenly became unavailable. Reality finally showed itself. In Nigeria, being a widow with a child is one of the loneliest experiences a woman can face. I started selling clothes online just to survive. Sometimes I carried David on my back while delivering goods inside Lagos buses under hot sun. Some customers insulted me, some cheated me, some men tried taking advantage of my situation. One landlord even told me directly, single mothers usually bring problems into compounds. I cried countless nights after hearing those words. Then, Martins returned into my life. Martins was my former boyfriend before I married Emeka. We dated briefly during university days before life separated us. One afternoon, while delivering clothes at a restaurant in Ikeja, I suddenly saw him sitting with some businessmen. At first, I wanted to avoid him because I felt ashamed of my condition. But he recognized me immediately. "Kate?" I froze. "Martins?" He stood up immediately, looking shocked. "What happened to you?" The moment he asked that question, tears almost escaped my eyes. Life had happened to me. Martins became supportive after that day. He occasionally bought foodstuff for David and helped me with some business connections. He was successful already, always dressed neatly, always driving expensive cars. Sometimes I wondered if I made the wrong choice years ago by not marrying him, but life had already happened. One evening, Martins invited me to a birthday dinner at a restaurant in Victoria Island. That was where I met Chike for the first time. Chike was handsome, confident, and wealthy. A businessman involved in electronics importation, the type of man people naturally respected once he entered a room. Throughout the dinner, I noticed that Chike kept looking at me repeatedly. At some point, Martin smiled and said jokingly, "My guy, stop looking at the woman like that." Everybody laughed, but deep down, something had already started. Later that night, after the dinner, Martins called me. "Kate." "Yes?" "What do you think of Chike?" I laughed nervously. "Why are you asking?" "He likes you." I became silent immediately. "Martins, you know my condition." "So?" "I have a child." Martins laughed confidently. "That one no be problem. In fact, it's even an advantage." I didn't understand what he meant then. Later, Martins explained everything to Chike privately. "My friend," Martins told him, "if you marry Kate, at least you already know she can give birth, no infertility issues, no delay drama. She already has a son." Chike laughed. That statement sounded simple then, but years later, those same words would become one of the biggest problems in our marriage. Everything happened very fast. Too fast. Chike began visiting me frequently. He bought gifts for David. He paid my rent without hesitation. Sometimes he took us out to expensive places I had only seen online. After years of suffering, his attention felt like heaven. One evening, while we sat at a Legoshi beach watching the ocean waves, Chike held my hand gently. "Kate." "Yes?" "I know life has hurt you, but I want to take care of you and David." Immediately, tears entered my eyes. No man had spoken to me like that since Emeka died. Chike continued softly. David will become my son too, I promise you. That night, I believed him completely, maybe too completely. 6 months later, we got married traditionally in Imo State. Everybody celebrated happily. My family thanked God that I found another husband despite already having a child. Even some church women told me I was lucky because many men avoid single mothers completely. But looking back now, I realized something important. Nobody truly prepared Chike for the emotional responsibility of marrying a woman who already had a child. Everybody only focused on love. Nobody focused on reality. At first, life was beautiful, very beautiful. We moved into a comfortable apartment in Lekki. David started calling Chike daddy. Sometimes watching them together melted my heart completely. Chike bought him toys, school bags, clothes, even bicycles. Anytime people asked, "Is this your son?" Chike proudly answered yes. I felt safe again. For the first time after Emeka's death, I finally believed happiness had returned into my life. Then, 2 years later, I became pregnant. The entire family celebrated, especially Chike. He became even more protective and caring during the pregnancy. He attended hospital appointments, bought baby clothes, prayed constantly for a healthy child. Then, finally, I gave birth to a baby boy. We named him Bright. That was the beginning of the silent division inside our home. At first, the changes were small, almost invisible. Chike became more emotionally attached to Bright than David. At first, I ignored it because I thought it was natural, but gradually, the differences became obvious. One evening, David innocently entered our room. "Daddy, can you help me with my assignment?" Chike barely looked up from his phone. "Later." Minutes later, Bright started crying inside the baby cot. Immediately, Chike rushed over with concern. "My son, what happened?" I noticed the sadness on David's face that night, and honestly, that was the first moment fear entered my heart. As years passed, the differences became worse. If David broke something accidentally, Chike became angry quickly. If Bright did the same thing, Chike laughed it off. Children will always be children. At first, I tried correcting it gently, but he always denied it. "You are overthinking." Still, I noticed everything. Mothers always notice everything. One afternoon, during family lunch, Bright climbed onto Chike's lap happily. Meanwhile, David sat quietly eating alone. Suddenly, Chike smiled proudly and said, "Bright behaves exactly like me." Immediately, David asked innocently, "Daddy, do I behave like you too?" The entire dining table became quiet. For some seconds, Chike didn't know what to say. Then he forced a smile. "You behave like your mother." That statement looked small, but it broke David's heart slowly, and honestly, mine too. The real explosion happened years later when school fees became difficult during economic hardship. Nigeria was becoming harder for everybody. Business slowed down, dollar increased, Chike's importation business started suffering heavy losses. For the first time since our marriage, financial pressure entered the house seriously. One evening, Chike entered the sitting room looking frustrated. "Kate, we need to talk." Immediately, my heart became uneasy. "What happened?" He sat down heavily. "I can't continue paying private school fees for both boys." I became confused. "What do you mean?" Chike sighed deeply. "We need to transfer one child to public school." My chest tightened instantly. "One child?" "Yes." Silence followed. Then he spoke the words that changed our home forever. "If one of them must remain in private school, it should be Bright." I felt like someone slapped me physically. "What?" Chike looked defensive immediately. "Bright is my son." I stared at him in disbelief. "And David is what?" Chike sighed impatiently. "Kate, stop twisting my words. No, answer me. He already has another father." The moment those words entered the air, everywhere became silent, completely silent. David was standing quietly near the passage. He heard everything, and from that night, nothing remained the same. I didn't sleep. Nobody slept in that house, but silence was louder than any scream I had ever heard in my life. I sat in the sitting room until dawn, staring at the same wall, thinking how love could turn into something so cold without dying physically. David never came out of his room. Bright slept peacefully, like innocence always does, unaware that decisions had been made about his future that had nothing to do with him. And Chike stayed in the guest room that night for the first time in years, and that was when I knew something had already broken beyond repair. Chike left the house without speaking to me. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence, the kind that feels like rejection without words. Days turned into weeks, and the house became two worlds living under one roof. Chike and Bright in one world, David and I in another. Chike stopped correcting Bright completely. In fact, he overprotected him like he was the only child that mattered. Bright became the center of everything. New toys, better clothes, private tutors, while David slowly became invisible in the same house he once called home. I tried to talk to Chike many times. I said, "You are hurting David," but he always replied, "I am just doing what is necessary for my biological son." And every time he said biological son, it felt like David was being erased, one word at a time. One evening, David came back from school and quietly placed his report card on the table. He had passed excellently. I smiled proudly and called Chike to show him. Chike looked at it briefly and said, "Good," and turned back to Bright, who was drawing on the floor. That single "good" felt like nothing. David stood there waiting for something more, something like pride, something like love, but it never came. He slowly picked up his report card and walked away without saying a word. That night, I found him crying in the bathroom, silently, so nobody would hear him. That was the moment I knew something in him was beginning to change permanently. Not childhood sadness, but emotional withdrawal. Then came the school issue again. Chike insisted Bright must remain in private school. I asked, "What about David?" And he said he will transfer. I said, "To where?" He said, "Public school." I begged him. I said, "Don't separate them like this." But he was firm. "Kate, I cannot carry what I cannot afford." But I knew it was not just about money anymore. It was about priority. And David was no longer a priority in his eyes. When David heard he was changing schools, he didn't cry, he just nodded. And that silence hurt me more than tears, because children who stop crying are starting to give up inside. The day he resumed public school, he wore his old shoes, too small, worn out. I watched him walk out, and I felt like I had failed him twice, once as a widow and now as a wife. Things got worse financially. Chike's business collapsed gradually. Imported goods were stuck at ports. Debt started piling up. Stress entered his voice. Anger entered his tone. And frustration entered his eyes. But instead of bringing us together, it divided us further. Now he was not just emotionally distant from David, he became emotionally distant from me too. Arguments became daily. "Why are you defending that boy so much?" he would shout. And I would answer, "Because he is my son." And he would reply, "And Bright is my blood." And that sentence became the foundation of our destruction. Meanwhile, Martins reappeared again during this season of tension. He came one evening unannounced. I hadn't seen him in years. He looked older, more successful, but also more observant. He sat down and looked around the house and said quietly, "So, this is how it turned out." I asked, "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly and said nothing, but his silence felt heavy, like he knew something I didn't. Later that night, he called me privately and said, "Kate, I think Chike is starting to see reality now." I asked, "What reality?" He paused and then said that marrying a single mother is not as simple as people think. Those words entered my chest like ice. I asked him, "Did you not recommend me to him?" And he went quiet. That silence was an answer I didn't want. Over time, the marriage became colder. Chike stopped sitting at the dinner table with us. Sometimes he would eat alone in his room. David stopped trying to connect with him completely. Bright still loved him innocently, but even Bright could feel tension in the air. Children feel energy before words explain it. Then came the breaking point that no one expected. One evening, I overheard a conversation between Chike and Martins outside the house. I stood behind the door and listened. Chike was angry. "You didn't tell me everything about her past." Martins replied calmly, "I told you enough." Chike said, "You told me she already had a son like it was nothing." Martins laughed slightly and said, "That was the point." My heart stopped. Chike said, "You used me." Martins replied, "No, I prepared you." Silence followed. Then Chike said something I will never forget. "So, you knew her before Emeka?" Martins didn't answer immediately. Then he said quietly, "Yes, I did." My knees weakened because that was the truth I had buried. Martins and I had history, brief, unfinished before Emeka, and he had never told Chike that part. Chike entered our marriage believing everything was simple, clean, and calculated. But it was not. It was layered with history he never understood. When I stepped into the room, they both stopped talking immediately. Chike looked at me differently that night, not as a wife, but as someone whose story he had misunderstood from the beginning. Everything exploded after that. Chike accused me of manipulation, Martins disappeared from our lives again after that confrontation, and I was left in the middle of a fire I didn't start but could not escape. Weeks later, Chike moved out temporarily, saying he needed space, but that space became months. David became quieter, withdrawn, emotionally distant from everyone. Bright started asking, "Where is Daddy?" And I had no answer. Years passed like that, slow, painful, unstable, until something unexpected happened. One day, Chike returned, not the same man, older, humbled, tired. He came and sat down and said, "Kate, I have been thinking for years." I didn't respond. He continued, "I destroyed this family with assumptions." I looked at him and said, "No, we all did." David, now older, walked in and saw him. There was silence between father and son who were no longer sure what they were to each other. Chike tried to speak, but David said softly, "You don't need to explain anything anymore," and walked away. That moment broke Chike more than any argument ever did. Years later, after counseling, after separation phases, after financial rebuilding, after long, painful conversations, we began to understand something important. Love alone cannot sustain a blended family without emotional preparation. Chike learned that blood does not determine responsibility, and I learned that healing from widowhood does not mean rushing into another emotional gamble. Martins eventually confessed privately that his recommendation came from pride and unfinished feelings, not wisdom, and that truth hurt more than anything else. But time changed us all. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to forgive without forgetting. Today, when I look back, I don't just see pain. I see ignorance, rushed decisions, unspoken expectations, and emotional immaturity disguised as love. I am Kate, and if you are listening to my story, understand this. Marrying a single mother is not a mistake, but entering it without emotional maturity, patience, and unconditional acceptance can destroy more than one life. It can destroy generations of trust. And sometimes, the real tragedy is not the marriage itself, but what people refuse to understand before saying, "I do."
This is Beyond Stories, where every story carries a lesson, and every lesson touches the heart. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could inspire your next step.